Some places have an outsized impact on our lives. They draw us to them, stoke our imaginations, and demand that we visit them. This is the story of one of those places. It's also the story of how I got into kayaking. It all started here. Doesn't look like much, does it? I saw this sign at Salt Creek State Park near Port Angeles on a trip to the coast. As you can see, it's a map of the old coast defense forts that once guarded the entrance to Puget Sound. Most of them I was familiar with. Fort Casey, Fort Worden, Fort Eby. But then there was this little one south of LaConner, Fort Whitman. I'd never heard of it, and it seemed unlikely that an emplacement on the scale of the others could still exist, hidden somewhere. I suspected that perhaps it had been proposed, but never built, or somehow had come into legend without actually existing. Some research on the internet turned up this diagram of the site, which located the fort on Goat Island south of LaConner. It gave a location on the island, but nothing was visible in satellite photos. The other forts show it very clearly in overhead images, so it seemed likely that whatever had been there was now gone. Beyond the drawing, I found nothing online. No photos, no trip reports, nothing that would indicate it ever existed. On another trip to the peninsula, I visited the Coast Artillery Museum in Port Townsend and asked about Fort Whitman. They said, "Well, we've heard of it, but no one from here has ever been there, so if you go, send pictures." There's only one way to find out if this place really existed. Living in the Northwest, I was familiar with kayaks, but had only ever actually paddled once on a school trip. Nonetheless, I started researching them, decided what I thought I wanted, and finally bought one. I started paddling in Whatcom Creek, then out on Bellingham Bay. It took several months, but eventually I got to a point where I felt comfortable enough to try the trek to Goat Island. And so, on March 1st, 2010, I set off from LaConner in search of the fabled Fort Whitman. The first challenge when I reached the island was finding somewhere to land. There were beaches on the north side of the island, but they appeared to back up to sheer cliffs. I paddled around the south side and eventually found a small rocky beach from which I could clamber onto the island. I began breaking trail across country, trusting my sense of direction to eventually lead me to where the fort should be, if it even existed. Eventually I found a narrow trail, and since it seemed to be leading in the right general direction, I followed it. Coming around a bend in the trail, I spotted a flat spot, then a straight line, and then the fort opened up before me. I had arrived at Fort Whitman. Construction on Fort Whitman was begun in 1908 and it entered service 3 years later. The fort consisted of one battery of 4 6-inch rifled guns on disappearing carriages, similar to this one at Fort Stevens in Warrenton, Oregon. This type of gun is referred to as a disappearing rifle because when the gun is fired, the recoil causes it to move back and downwards on its carriage. The gun can then be reloaded behind and below the parapet and moves back up into firing position on springs. While the better-known triangle of fire, consisting of Forts Worden, Flagler, and Casey, guarded the main entrance to Puget Sound, Fort Whitman protected the back door against ships entering through Deception Pass. In between the 4 gun positions are these rooms whose thick concrete walls held powder and shells for guns and a fire control plotting room. Other rooms contained a pair of 25-kilowatt gasoline generators for electricity and even stored mines. This building, which I originally thought was the powerhouse, is actually an armored latrine.
Sempre di sole.
Also on the island is a smaller facility which served both as an observation post and also controlled electrically detonated sea mines which could be placed in the passive or threatened. Despite dating from the same era as the other facilities, this building is architecturally unique amongst all the forts I visited.